What's up guys, Asian here with another gear video, and today we're going to be taking a look at the stamina DPS. So stam DPS, it looked like we were going to have a change in the meta. It looked like we would have a little bit of flexibility with Greymoor PTS, but then they decided to pull a Horns of the Reach on us and decided to nerf the new and improved Black Rose Prison dual wield and the Masters dual wield. Pretty much putting them on the side burner once again. So where it looked like we were going to do dual wield, now it looks like we're doing dual wield bow instead, or rather we are keeping with our dual wield bow setup here. Kind of a disappointment. I was actually looking forward to having some flexibility here, using dual wield bow in some situations and dual wield in others, but of course ZOS decided to take their rebalancing act another step and rebalance the dual wield build, so it is no longer viable. That being said though, dual wield bow is still capable of pulling very good DPS. The DPS difference was already fairly small between those two setups there. It was really just a matter of cleave versus single target damage. So nothing much has actually changed here in terms of stamina DPS gear and other sort of stamina DPS generic information. So this is just going to be about gear and going to be about class agnostic things like race, attribute distributions, food, those sorts of things. If you're looking for skill bars, if you're looking for rotation, that is for each of the class-specific videos, which I will link in the description below. The links will come out as they are released throughout the end of May and into June. So this is just for the gear. Once again, just want to reiterate, this is only for gear and other class-agnostic setups here. So let's go ahead and get started. There's quite a few gear sets we want to talk about after all. First of all, this is going to be one of the better setups here. This is going to be the meta setup essentially. There are obviously other setups you could run, but this is going to give you the most single target damage in the game. In situations where you want more cleave damage, you will obviously want to swap out some of these sets because some of these sets are obviously geared more towards single target damage than cleave damage. First, for our must-helm sets, you really have two options here when it comes to must-helm sets. I am wearing Selene's because this is pretty much brain dead. You don't really need to do anything extra for Selene, you just have to go ahead and deal damage. The other option is going to be a Maarselok, which we'll talk about in a few minutes here, but Maarselok is a little bit more involved. It does involve being able to bash weave appropriately, and it also cuts into sustain because you are also bashing as well, and that ends up eating into your stamina pool. Selene's doesn't really have that. The downside of Selene's, though, is that it is only single target damage compared to Maarselok, which has a little bit of a cleave damage because it is a clone. Next, for our first 5-piece set, we are running Perfected Relequens. Not much has changed here. It's still the strongest single target set in the game. You don't have to run the perfect version. This one comes from completing Cloudrest on +1 or above on veteran difficulty. Normal version is just fine. You will be missing out on the additional max stamina, but that's not that big of a DPS loss for stamina DPS. Our second 5-piece set, this is our front bar set, is going to be Perfected Lokkestiiz. This comes from Sunspire on veteran difficulty. You don't have to do hard mode or anything. You can just do it on vet. The normal version, again, is perfectly fine to run. This is a front bar set, so you will be on the back bar a little bit, so it's not going to be as important to maintain the 5-piece at all times. The perfect version is going to be a little bit stronger because it does add weapon crit, and that is a stronger armor bonus compared to max stamina, but ultimately it's not going to be a noticeable DPS loss in the grand scheme of things here. So you could just farm Sunspire on normal for the normal version of Lokkestiiz while you are farming for the perfect version of this set. For our weapons, dual wield is still our best option here on the front bar here, so we're still doing Dagger Axe. Now I am running Nirnhone Sharpen, and that's just because the Trial Diamond does not have Tremor Scale. In an actual raid environment, you would probably want to use something like Precise instead if your tank is running Tremor Scale. Tremor Scale provides about 2400 additional penetration, so you don't need Sharpened any longer if your tank is running Tremor Scale. You can instead run Precise and tone down a little bit on the Piercing CP as well, just because now you have additional physical penetration through Tremor Scale. Still using double ravage health poisons, so don't have to necessarily worry about enchants at all. These are still going to be the best option for you for target DPS. For our back bar, we're running the bow, the Maelstrom, or the Master's Bow, depending on whether you want cleave or single target damage, and whether you want more consistent single target damage versus something that you're going to have to rely on the boss to stay within your endless hail for. Now, the perfect versions or versus the non-perfect versions, not going to really matter too much. Typically speaking, you're going to be on your back bar for a short enough period of time that additional bonuses that you get from the perfect versions of those weapons really going to be very minor increase to your DPS. So don't necessarily worry about farming Veteran Maelstrom or Veteran Dragonstar for the perfect version of those bows. You can just run the non-perfect versions that you get from the normal versions of those arenas. So really up to you which one you want to go for. For traits and enchants, on your bow back bar, we have an infused weapon damage enchant. It's going to be the best use here. And then we're again running Nirnhoned and Precise. We're running Sharpen just for the parse here. But again, Nirnhoned Precise for our front bar dual wield. Make sure your Nirnhoned is going to be on your main hand. It doesn't really matter which weapon you have. It can be dagger or axe in the main hand. Doesn't matter. It just make sure you have Nirnhoned on this main hand weapon here. For jewelry, Bloodthirsty with weapon damage enchants across the board. You could also run Infused. There are going to be some fights where Infused is going to be a little bit better, and that's just because you won't necessarily need to worry so much about DPS in Execute, either because Execute is very, very short, or it's just essentially non-existent, or the fight prioritizes more upfront damage and actual Execute damage. But Bloodthirsty is going to give you the highest single target DPS in 99% of fights in this game. Armor, all divines, all max stamina enchants. You can replace one of these with a health enchant if you so desire for more survivability, but it is not absolutely necessary. Most stamina DPS will be running blue food, so you will not have any issues with your max health that way. Now, in terms of other armor sets, we will first start off with crafted sets, move on to Overland sets, then dungeons, and then trial sets. So starting things off with our Overland sets, there are a handful of them that are pretty decent that you're going to want to have on hand. First one here, we're just going by alphabetical order, is going to be Hunting's Rage. This is a classic, tried and true, very consistent set to run here. This is a base game set, requires you to know 6 traits in order to craft this yourself. This comes from the final zone for each of the 3 different alliance areas. So for example, Ralka, I believe it is the Rift, and Bankorai, I believe, is the final zone for DC areas there. So if you can't craft this yourself, you can normally find somebody to craft this for you as long as you're able to provide materials. It's always nice, obviously, to tip, but that's usually not necessary. Very, very consistent damage here. Because it's a static 5-piece bonus, you're going to want to make sure to wear this on the body instead or on both bars. Next is Mechanical Acuity. This one comes from a DLC zone. This comes from Clockwork City. So you can either buy it, you can craft it yourself. This is also a 6-trait set, or you can commission somebody to craft this for you. Pretty decent for burst damage. It's going to be a little bit weaker compared to some other sets in terms of sustained DPS, but the burst potential for Mechanical Acuity is incredibly high here. The downside is the 3-piece obviously doesn't really provide you any bonuses because it adds spell damage, which you're not really going to be using much of. But in terms of burst potential, Mechanical Acuity is definitely up there as one of the stronger sets in the game. And finally, we have New Moon Acolyte, which is a little bit more difficult to craft yourself because this is a 9-trait set. So typically speaking, you'll be buying this off of Guild Trader or commissioning a Master Craftsman to make this for you. This is also a DLC set. This comes from Southern Elsewhere. So again, if you don't have access to the DLC, you will have to buy it or commission somebody to craft it for you. Now, with New Moon Acolyte, you do get a physical penetration armor bonus there with the 4-piece, so you will have to shift your CP points around a little bit if you're using this set, including if you are swapping out of this set for whatever reason for a different setup for bosses or something like that. Also keep in mind that you are increasing the cost of all of your abilities by 5%, and this does include your ultimate, so just be mindful of that. You will have to adjust potentially for the sustained increase sustained decrease that you're getting by running New Moon Acolyte. But this is a very consistent set and a very powerful set if you're able to sustain the additional cost there. Now for Overland sets, there really aren't too many Overland sets that you can run here, but there are a handful. First one's going to be Spriggan's Thorn, which is pretty good for trash fights, just because there are going to be instances where you might not necessarily be able to get all debuffs, physical penetration debuffs, I should say, on all the trash. So, for example, if you don't have a Necromancer in group, you won't have a source of AoE Major Fracture potentially, so you're going to want the additional physical penetration that Spriggan's Thorns can provide. Not used very often because you do have a Necromancer, you have AoE Major Fracture, and Alkosh can hit multiple enemies, so not something you typically see being worn in endgame content. The only other medium armor set that's really worth talking about is going to be Briarheart. This comes from Hrothgar. I also should mention here that Spriggan's Thorns comes from Bankorai, which is a base game set. Briarheart comes from Hrothgar, which is a DLC zone, so you will have to farm this, have access to the DLC in order to farm it yourself, or you can buy it off of Guild Traders if you don't have access to the zone. This essentially acts as a Hunding's Rage, except it does carry over to your back bar, so it can be stronger than Hunding's Rage here. Plus, it provides a little bit of additional heal as well, so it's actually pretty decent for self-sustain if you want this sort of nice balance between decent damage and a little bit of self-healing as well. Obviously, not going to be stronger than something like Lokkestiiz, Relequen, or New Moon Acolyte, but the additional heal could be beneficial, particularly in progression, if you're willing to sacrifice a little bit of DPS in order to get that additional survivability. That's pretty much it for Overland sets. Next for dungeon sets. A couple of dungeon sets here to talk about. Starting from the top, working our way to down. First one is going to be Leviathan. This is essentially the stamina version of Mother's Sorrow. This is a base game set, comes from Crypt of Hearts. Much like Hunding's Rage, it is a static bonus, so you are going to make sure to have this on your body, ideally, in order to maintain that bonus on both bars, or you can just run both weapons and bow if you decide to run weapons instead. Fairly easy farm, so pretty easy set for beginners to get into. Draugr Hulk is something I want to point out here. This is essentially Necropotence for stamina and DPS users, a bunch of max stamina here. This comes from Direfrost Keep, so also a base game set. Going to be weaker than Leviathan overall, just because max stamina is not going to be as beneficial for stamina DPS, but still an option if you are farming Direfrost Keep for whatever reason. Again, a good beginner set, but it still is not as good as Leviathan, so you might want to run Leviathan instead. And then finally, we will have Sogvin's Warband, which is a pretty strong set overall. So you get the additional physical penetration from the 4-piece, so make sure to adjust your CPs accordingly. The 5-piece adds some additional crit chance, plus you get Minor Force. So you will still be running Barb's Trap for the additional dot that it provides, but you won't necessarily have to worry so much about the uptime on it any longer for the Minor Force buff, because Sogvin is going to provide it for you. It just adds a bunch of weapon crit, which is a pretty strong bonus here. So Sogvin's is a very powerful set here that most people will be running in endgame content for trash fights, AoE fights particularly. This is a DLC set though. This does come from Frostvault, so you will need to have access to that dungeon in order to farm for this set. A couple of the sets that you're going to see used less often, but still worth noting here. Azure Blight for AoE. This comes from Lair of Maarselok. Aegis Caller, same thing here for the AoE. This comes from Unhallowed Grave. Less commonly used, but still potentially strong here. The main weakness with Aegis Caller is that once the Aegis is summoned, it stays in place, so it won't move around. So if Trash Fight is very mobile, for example, not going to be as beneficial. It does have a fairly wide radius, but it's not really enormous. It's about the size of a Healing Springs. Azure Blight. This one's fairly strong for AoE, again, because of that explosion, but only one person can wear this at a time, so it's not really something you see used very often because only one person can make use of it. Now, I also want to point out Scavenging Demise from Depths of Malatar. This is another uncommon set to be seen run, but it does have its uses in certain scenarios. This basically applies Minor Vulnerability for 15 seconds. So this is basically a way to apply Minor Vulnerability here. Now, normally speaking, you would be getting this from something like a Warden Healer running Fettering Infection, or from Shock Damage enchants with the Concussed procs from enchants. However, there might be instances where you might not have those sources of Minor Vulnerability. I'm thinking in particular if you need to run the downstairs group, for example, where you won't be having a healer in Sunspire against Navintas. In those instances, Scavenging Demise might have a use there because Minor Vulnerability is a pretty strong debuff that adds a lot of damage. So could want to pick up this set here. Again, this comes from Depths of Malatar, so make sure to have access to that dungeon if you're going to farm for this set. Finally, for trial sets, we pretty much covered the two main ones, Relequen and Lokkestiiz, but there is at least two more that I would like to talk about. First one is going to be known as Twice-Fanged Serpent or Two-Fanged Snake. This comes from Sanctum Ophidia, so this is a base game set. Pretty much falls into the same boat as Spriggan's Thorns, where it provides a bunch of physical penetration for those trash fights where you're not necessarily going to be able to get a lot of debuffs on all the enemies. Again, not very useful for boss fights, just because you're typically able to hit the pen cap very easily with bosses, more for trash instead. Then we have Viscous Serpent, also known as Viscous Ophidian. This comes from all three Craglorn trials, another base game set. This is the only source of Minor Slayer in the base game, so for stamina DPS, I should say. The set itself is going to pale in comparison to Relequen and Lokkestiiz here. The 5-piece just adds some additional sustain, which can be very beneficial, particularly in solo instances like Maelstrom Arena, for example, or for trash fights like Blacklord's Prison or Dungeons. But generally speaking, in terms of raw damage, it's not going to be quite as strong as other trial sets that provide Minor Slayer. Finally, I do want to point out Alkosh here, just because sometimes you will be using this as a DPS. Mainly it's going to be used in Sunspire, just because of certain strategies that the tanks use don't really put them in a good position to use Alkosh. So you will want to keep this on hand if you're running Sunspire, because you might be asked to run this as a stamina DPS just for Sunspire, though. That pretty much covers it for medium trial sets. I would talk about War Machine, but Lokkestiiz exists, pretty much making War Machine obsolete. And finally, let's go ahead and talk about monster helms. So the first monster helm to talk about here that we could potentially run is going to be Krog's. This is mainly going to be for that one-piece physical penetration. So running something like one-piece Krog with one-piece Velidreth, which provides weapon damage, is a fairly common setup for trash fights. Again, because you might need additional physical penetration to offset the loss of certain debuffs in trash fights. The 2-piece is actually not very strong compared to some other monster helm sets, so you will not usually be running the 2-piece, mainly going to be for the 1-piece physical penetration bonus instead. Next we have, where is it? We have Velidreth. So this adds weapon damage on the 1-piece, so again combine this with Krog's for a pretty decent trash setup here. But the 2-piece is fairly decent actually. So you summon 3 disease spores in front of you and they deal a certain amount of disease damage. This occurs every 8 seconds. So you do get a little bit of cleave with Velidreth because you do have 3 disease spores. One shoots out directly in front of you and the other 2 go off at about, I'd say, 30 to 40 degree angles away from you, to the left and the right of you. So pretty decent. This is a quasi-ranged set because these do travel a fair distance before they explode and are useless essentially. You could run this if you have to play at range or if you're moving around a lot, but it does require you to basically aim yourself, so to speak, in order to get the proc to hit. So it could be a little bit challenging to use at this sort of quasi-range distance. And then finally we have Maarselok, which I touched upon earlier. This comes from Lair of Maarselok, so you need to have access to that dungeon there. This is going to be the strongest monster helm set if you're able to sustain it, because you obviously need to bash, and that does cut into your sustain there. It also does complicate the rotation a little bit here, because you will need to bash every 7 seconds. So Maarselok is definitely going to give you the highest amount of damage, but it does add another layer of complexity to rotation, so it might be challenging for some people to use, especially if you have high levels of ping or lag issues. And that pretty much covers it for all of these sets that I'd like to talk about here. Next, moving on to our character sheet, so moving on to other class-agnostic features. So I am a Dark Elf here. The 2 best races for stamina DPS are going to be Dark Elves and Orcs. Both races get 258 additional weapon damage. Orcs get 2,000 max stamina, and they also get additional max health as well, 1,000 max health, so they get a little bit of additional cushion room there for survivability. Dark Elves get 1875 max stamina. Now, they also get 1875 max magicka and 258 spell damage, so if you want to swap between stamina and magic DPS, Dark Elves are going to be a pretty good option for you there. Dark Elves in general are just a very good, well-rounded race for pretty much all 3 roles, so if you do want to be a little bit flexible with your role, Dark Elves are a pretty good sort of happy middle ground to meet. 3 other races are potentially good, but they do not have the same sort of DPS ceiling that Dark Elves and Orcs have. These are going to be the Imperials, Red Guards, and the Wood Elves. All 3 of these races get 2,000 max stamina, but they do not get the additional weapon damage that Dark Elves and Orcs get. Instead, they get some sort of additional sustained passive. So, for example, Wood Elves get 258 additional stamina regen. Imperials get 3% cost reduction on all abilities and 333 health, magic, and stamina back whenever they deal damage every few seconds. And Red Guards get 990 stamina back whenever they deal damage every few seconds as well. DPS ceiling is definitely going to be lower because you're missing out on a fair amount of weapon damage, but your sustain is going to be a lot better. So for longer sustained fights, you will obviously be able to sustain your rotation better. Your DPS just won't quite reach the same levels as an Orc or a Dark Elf. But those are the 5 main races you're going to be using. Khajiits could also be used there because they're kind of fit into the same sort of role as Dark Elves, where they're very good at all roles, but not necessarily the best at all roles. So you could run Khajiits as well, but those are definitely not going to be as strong as Dark Elves or Orcs. For attributes, 64 points go into stamina here. Again, we will be running blue food, typically speaking, in a trial, so that provides both max health and max stamina, so you won't necessarily need to run any points into health there in order to hit that 17k max health recommendation. You could run some more points into health if you'd like, just for some additional survivability, but you will be giving up some damage in order to do so. So kind of make sure you're meeting that trade-off very well. Next, for Munderstone, we're running the Shadow, still going to be the strongest Munderstone choice here. And then we are running Lavafoot here just because of parse purposes, but again, like I mentioned, you will be running blue food instead. So your blue food is going to be the base game blue food, so that's going to be something like braised rabbit with spring vegetables here, which increases your max health and max stamina. Now, if you need the additional sustain, you could run something like our Tam Takeaway Broth instead, which gives you max health, max stamina, and stamina regen. It just doesn't give you as much max health or max stamina as a blue food does. So you will need to be able to pad out your health somehow there, and your DPS healing is going to end up being a little bit lower just because you're not getting as high max stamina. Now, if you can't afford our Tam Takeaway Broth, because this does use Powdered Mother of Pearl, you can run a slightly weaker version of this, which is Dubious Corn Throne instead. Finally, the last thing we want to talk about is going to be our champion points. So just to give you guys an idea, this is assuming we do not have Tremor Scale. If you do have Tremor Scale, you will need to shift your blue CP points around a little bit. For our green CPs, full points in the Mooncalf, 100 points in the Mooncalf, and then 75 in Tenacity. You can place the remaining points however you'd really like. So for example, 31 Shadow Ward, 31 Tumbling, then I have 33 Warlord. And if you're running Maarselok, you can put points into Bashing Focus in order to reduce the cost of Bash. I highly recommend doing so if you are running Maarselok as your main monster helm set here. Just help out your sustain a little bit more. For blue CPs, again, just to reiterate, we are assuming we're not getting Tremor Scale here for the trial dummy purposes, but if you are getting Tremor Scale, remember that you're getting just shy of 2400 additional penetration from Tremor Scale. You also are going to end up dropping Sharpen, so that you need to add in another 1376. So in total, you're dropping about a little over 1,000 additional penetration from Piercing, so you're going to want to hit, roughly speaking, about 4 to 3,300 physical penetration with Piercing if you have Tremor Scale in the group and you're not running Sharpened. If you're running Tremor Scale and Sharpened, then you just have to decrease Piercing by 2,400, roughly speaking, so you should be sitting at about 2,000 physical penetration from Piercing. Again, the goal is to hit 18,200 physical penetration between all of your debuffs and your sort of passive bonuses here, so just fix Piercing to hit that 18,200. Then we have 45 Mighty, 52 Precise Strikes, 48 Thaumaturge, 61 Mastered Arms. There will be slight differences between classes. For example, on a Nightblade, you're going to have a little bit higher Mastered Arms compared to Thaumaturge. Stam Decay, for example, would have a little bit more equitable distribution. You'll have a little bit more into Thaumaturge than I would have here. But those are very minor differences, and you're talking about maybe less than a 1% point difference in overall DPS. But again, if you want to shift points around in Piercing, so let's say you have Sharpened and you have Tremor Scale, you're going to want to drop this down to about 2,000 or so. So you're going to be running around 23 Piercing. Bump Mighty up to 64. You can bump Thaumaturge back up to 56. Precise Strikes can go up to 61. And then Master Arms can go up to 66. This would be if you're running Sharpened with Tremor Scale. Now, if you are running Tremor Scale without Sharpened, so you're running Precise instead on your offhand, then you will need to run about 33 to 3,400 Piercing. So you're going to drop Mighty down to 56. You're going to drop Precise Strikes down to 56. You're going to drop Thaumaturge down to 52. You're going to be running about 40 to 41 points into Piercing instead if you're running Tremor Scale and dropping Sharpen for Precise instead. So a couple of different setups there for you guys there. Finally, for our red CPs, we have 81 Ironclad, 61 Thick Skin, 64 into Hardy, and Elemental Defender. This is a very balanced approach to our red CPs, which should give us pretty decent mitigation across all pieces of content that you could run in the game. And that pretty much covers it for this gear video. So in the description below, I will have links to all of the class-specific videos that will be covering skills and rotations for all the different classes as they are released throughout May into June. Also down below, you will find a description of all the sets that I described, as well as where to find them, where you would want to use them, for example, body versus weapon front bar sets, for example, as well as when you would want to use them as well. Particularly, probably just going to be something like bosses versus AoE scenarios with probably some special notes here and there for certain sets. But if you guys have any other questions, feel free to leave them down in the comment section below. I'll try to answer them to the best of my ability. Other than that, I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.